Colonization is a paradox because it both destroys and creates, oppresses and liberates. Yet between each duality falls a thousand destroyed that cannot be recreated, and an oppressed that has failed to be liberated. And on this note, we remember the British colonization of India, beginning with the East India Company's victory over the Nawab of Bengal in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, until India gained its independence in 1947, irrevocably changing its fate. And in the case of Britain's colonization of India, the scales of fortune were tipped in favor of the former, while the latter was left to contend with the bitter legacy of exploitation and inequality. To begin with, the impact of colonization on Indian society as portrayed from the Indian perspective is a moral urgency that requires explaining why colonialism was the horror that lurks within their narrative. Shifting borders through the partitioning of India based on the religious basis, Pakistan at the north for Muslims, while the rest for Hindus and Christians, which emphasizes the effect of the divide and rule policy on the demographic and cultural fabric of the region, intensifying the communal lines between Hindus and Muslims, and all of these colonial mutations were eased by the British use of the caste system as a means to claim imperialist authority over India by creating a hierarchy based on race and religion, by institutionalizing it through colonial legislation such as the Criminal Tribes Act. During British rule, the caste system became more formalized as they used it as a tool for controlling and dividing the population, promoting the idea of social Darwinism, privileging the British highest social rungs and echelons, while Indians were relegated to lower ones in an imperial system that was an instrument of colonial control, which introduced English education to govern a class, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals, and in intellect. On another note, the British narrative depicted colonization as one that offered political gifts to India, such that introducing democratic institutions like free press, parliamentary democracy, and independent judiciary, the rule of law, one cannot deny that this is true, remaining as pillars of India's political system to this day. However, it's also true that the British colonial government's policies and practices in India were characterized by a significant lack of democracy and political freedom. For much of the colonial period, the British government ruled India as a colony, subjugating the views of the Indian people as political leaders and activists who advocated for independence or participated in resistance movements were arrested. Moreover, the British Raj Emperor coronation was an event that emphasized the bureaucratic and political impact of colonization in India, as the proclamation of King George V as Emperor of India in 1911, reinforcing the idea of British superiority over the Indian people, deliberately utilizing religion, caste, and class to create divisions and incite conflict among various ethnic groups in India. They appointed their officers as managing agents in each province to govern the traditional Indian population, favoring the British as political power shifting to the British Crown. In medieval times, India had a developed and stable economy with agriculture as a major industry. However, after 200 years of British rule, the introduction of economic policies favored the interests of the colonial rulers and their British counterparts, imposing heavy taxes on Indian farmers, leading to widespread poverty and unemployment, providing cash crops for Britain and not focusing on producing food for itself, leading to mass starvation and the Bengal famine. The certainty of struggles and the impossibility of a middle ground in the chain of colonization and annexation, as the colonizer stands on an ivory tower and the colonized is stuck between a rock and a hard place, caught between the demands of the colonizer and the challenges faced in turmoil, translates to seldom chances of meeting halfway through. The 19th century marked the emergence of Indian nationalist movements as Indians began to defy British colonial rule after the British Raj extended its imperialist authority over India in the Delhi Durbar 1911, celebrating the coronation of King George V as the Emperor of India, and despite the strained efforts of finding a middle ground, Indians endeavored to gain independence. One of the many individuals who acted as beacons of change is the social and political Bengali poet, writer, philosopher, and polymath Rabindranath Tagore, a devoted friend of Gandhi, who was the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913 for his collection of poems called Gitanjali, which deftly blended personal and political perspectives to convey Indian views on colonization. In the poem Where the Mind is Without Fear, written in 1910, Tagore uses metaphor, repetition, and imagery to highlight the religious and patriotic theme of praying for a utopian India and the spiritual emancipation of his country, in which diverse political and ideological currents could exist fearlessly without dreading the repercussions of speaking one's mind under the British rule. To begin with, Tagore calls out for a united country that is not tainted by lines of disparities, as he writes, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, emphasizing the walls of caste, creed, and religion, which apply to the context of India in the 19th century, as the caste system was exploited by the British for their ends to maintain their dominance and hegemony over India. The metaphor "the world has not been broken up into fragments" heightens the imperativeness of recognizing a liberated India that dismantles artificial barriers and fosters a sense of unity among individuals, and the line "by narrow domestic walls" crystallizes the Indian perspective on British colonization as a period that ensnared them in the domestic sphere, expecting them to conform to the narrow roles that were imposed upon them. Tagore extends on the idea of building an ideal country where sense and sensibility prevail, and Indians are free from the shackles of oppression. As he writes, where the clear storm of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, comparing reason to a stream that flows freely without getting lost in the dreary sand of dead habit, connoting the old and outdated customs and traditions that are like desert sand which absorbs water and bring man's reason to a halt. Furthermore, throughout the poem, the poet repeats the word where, stressing the idea that a liberated India seems out of reach in virtue of the historical context where the British colonization was at its peak, underscoring the pervasive nature of colonization and its impact on every aspect of Indian society and culture. Regardless of the tensive ties that bring together the colonizer and the colonized, it is never a solution to disregard one side of a complementary story. As the proverb says, until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. Accordingly, in the novel The Jungle Book by the English novelist Rudyard Kipling, who was born in India and is known for his stories that explore the themes of imperialism and colonization, the plot is not only set in India, but also depicts a vivid reality of its colonial life from a British perspective in a deeper sense. One can identify the British imperialist and condescending view of India through Kipling's use of diction and parallelism. To begin with, The Jungle Book, written in 1893, centers around a child named Mowgli, who lives among a pack of wolves enduring tribulations as he grows up in an Indian jungle and is inevitably faced with his own identity after coming into contact with other humans, unveiling complications of human nature. Additionally, on a profound level, the book was written as a commentary on the relationship between colonizers and colonized people, highlighting the idea that one culture is inherently superior to another. At the outset, the downgrading standpoint of the British towards Muslims is portrayed through Kipling's word choice, choosing a Muslim name for the antagonist, the evil tiger, Sher Khan, which contrasts with the British belief that any other religion than Christianity is regressive, primitive, and backward. Furthermore, Kipling's perception of the Indians as half-devil and half-child implies religious bigotry that surfaces in The Jungle Book when Baloo, Mowgli's mentor, describes monkey people as leaderless and disorderly, saying they have no law, they are outcasts, they have no speech of their own, and that marginalizes the monkeys, seeing them as lacking in law, leadership, and speech. However, they are anthropomorphized. The writer reinforces their otherness, establishing a hierarchy in the jungle and dividing the tribes and people, which endorses Britain's colonization of India, using the excuse that Indians needed the colonial power to civilize them as a common tactic to justify their subjugation and imperialist endeavors. Moreover, Mowgli represents the uncivilized or uncolonized India, who is intrigued by the jungle world and portrayed to need a protector to lead him to civilization, which parallels with the British perspective of being superior to native Indians, believing their duty was to guide and civilize them, which was reinforced in the white man's burden concept that justified colonialism. To conclude, Kipling uses simple terminology that fits the children's genre of his novel to indirectly depict by connotation the British impact of colonization on India as civilizing. In conclusion, I believe that the British colonization of India reaffirms the saying, "The sun never set on the British Empire because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark," signifying the British exploitive nature of manipulating the Indians by tempting them with fallacies such as railways and the introduction of English language, which are now useful but date back to colonial symbols of oppression, where Indians were enslaved to provide Britain with raw materials transported to the mother colony through the railway for industrialization purposes, which emphasizes the paradox of colonization and the injustices of life, where one has to pay the price for the development of another, with lifelong impacts on identity and culture that reflect the sheer effect of colonization and imperialism that goes beyond its concrete implications but also penetrates the essence of society.